But the shadow of war excites people as much as it frightens them. And in that terrible year of 1914, the fight began. Alan and Rex were in the army already, and Carol hurried to join them. Reggie wished that he was young enough to join up too, but as he was already over 60, I was spared the horror of having my husband at war. Oh, I remember those early days of the war, with flags waving and singing and placards everywhere, and services in the church where we all prayed that we might serve the good and have an early victory. We dreamt that our boys would soon return as heroic victors. You remember the Jabberwocky poem? We mothers saw our sons setting off to war and imagined them returning triumphant, having defeated the evil aggressor.
He took his vorpal sword in hand, and then 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went stick and snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. Oh, frabjous day, Calais, she chortled in her joy.
It wasn't like that. Slowly one learned of more and more friends and neighbours whose sons would never come back at all. Then there was the first death of a soldier from Lyndhurst, and all of us began to shudder at the thought of a telegraph boy coming up the road on his bicycle. The telegraph boy came up the East Drive to Cuffnells in 1916. Thank God, Alan was only wounded. He recovered quickly enough, and after 14 days' leave with us in Cuffnells, set off again to France, quite happy and determined to do his duty. The next telegram was different. I remember Reggie standing, white-faced with the paper crumpled in his hands. Alan, our eldest, had been killed somewhere in the Western Front. And then it seemed only a few weeks later, but it was really more than a year. This time, our second son, Rex, had been killed in the service of his king and country. My two eldest boys gone. Dear God, how I hate war. My two boys, my two lovely boys. We prayed and prayed and lived with our hearts in our mouths. And thank God Carol survived the next 2 years and came back to us after the war was ended. Peace. How glorious it seemed at first. But nothing was the same. Poor Reggie never really recovered from the two deaths. Between them, they killed him too, and he was nothing but a walking shadow after the war. Carol, God bless him, did all he could to break Reggie out of his silence and despair, but he never really succeeded. And then everything was so much more expensive, and the whole attitude of the country seemed to have changed. We were both in our 70s then, and we could not understand the new world. The British Empire had won the war, but everything that Reggie and I held dear about Britain seemed to have been washed away in those ghastly years of war. that came down to the forest. Money, mostly made in the war profiteers, Reggie used to call them. They hired away all the best servants and could afford to pay them outrageous wages. Servants. Oh yes, I expect some of you people from Lyndhurst have heard the story about the Gaylor girl. Well, she was rather a silly little thing and never very satisfactory as far as I was concerned. Everyone knows, of course, that windows and shutters must be opened before a fireplace is cleaned out. Otherwise, the dust that is raised is bound to stay in the room and cover any precious objects. Well, cleaning the fire was the Gaylor girl's job. But she hated opening the windows, particularly when it was cold. She used to say that opening the shutters hurt her chilblains. One morning, thinking that I was well asleep, she cleaned out the fire with the windows and shutters closed. I almost felt sorry for the girl when I opened the door and walked in on her. She jumped a mile and went bright scarlet. The next 10 minutes were full of, oh, my lady this, and oh, my lady that, and oh, these terrible chilblains, I can hardly even bear to pick up the hearth brush. Well, I'm not even sure that she had chilblains at all. And if she did, it was probably because she didn't have the sense to sleep in gloves in the servants' bedrooms. Anyway, the upshot of it was, I sent down to the chemist for some chilblain ointment, and naturally enough took the price of the ointment out of her wages for the next few weeks. I'm sure the silly girl learned a good lesson from that and always respected me for it.
Excuse me.
Well, as I was saying...
Excuse me. That silly girl you were talking about was a very sensible woman. She used to babysit for me, and she used to talk about you. I can tell you a lot of her stories.
And did she respect me for the lesson?
No. She thought you were a horrible mistress and lived in a horrible house, and she couldn't hear a good word about you.
And what happened to her after she left my service?
She went to the Comptons, to the rectory at Minstead.
I've heard that the gardener there used to leave a ladder by the servants' quarters so the maids could go to the village dances.
Yes, Mary told me about that. She was really happy at Minstead. They were so kind to her. And after that, she went on to Lord Montague at Beaulieu, and she was nursemaid there until she got married and had children of her own. And they still live in the village and are very much liked and respected.
Well,
so there.
Kindness is not necessarily the best training for the young. Anyway, I'm sorry if I upset your friend. I merely meant to teach her a salutary lesson. Anyway, it all happened at the very worst time for me, soon after Reggie's death. And things were different in those days, you have to understand. One thing that history should teach us is that things were different, and that they will be different again. Oh, yes, and those living memories people have after you are gone are always of you in your crotchety old age, not when you were young and sprightly. When you die, everyone who remembers you thinks you were always old. Listen, I'm sorry about Gaynor. Sometimes good intentions are not enough.